Okay.
All right. Don't put your hands in your pocket at all. Get them out of there. Good job.
Good afternoon, Bayhawks. We forgot one more important stop. For any of you who have been so lucky to have been given detention, feel free to go to room
Very lucky.
18, Miss Funkhauser's room. Hang out with me, Mr. Duprat. It will be no fun whatsoever.
I don't think it'd be fun. I don't know.
All right. Let me just play this slow. Get my pacing here.
Okay.
Okay, whenever you're ready.
Trying to like flatten the other side of my head. I'm just doing. How optimism has helped me through trying times. Wait. I had to put my hands in my pocket. Alright. How optimism has helped me through trying times. It's something I struggle to answer because for the majority of life I would say optimism wasn't a part of it. When I was young, I feel like that's the closest you could call me to being an optimist because I was able to see the best in everything. But the reason I wouldn't is because I couldn't comprehend any of the bad. If you look at me in my early high school years or early teens, you could see me as a nihilist on the complete opposite side of the spectrum, someone who blacked out all the good in the life and only took in the bad. But the reason I'm even able to stand before you now is because optimism has come into my life, and it's allowed me to recognize every aspect being both good and bad, and allowed me to make a better tomorrow out of it. But it wasn't always like this. Like I said, when I was around 7 or 8, I said you might mistake me for an optimist, in part because of my demeanor, with my almost defining confidence and bravado being a key factor to who I was. Because despite, me losing my first friend, losing my first family member, and my parents' marriage almost collapsing and crumbling, culminating in my dad's attempted suicide, I always kept a smile on my face. And that can seem pretty optimistic. I wouldn't blame you for thinking so, but the reason I said you would mistake me for an optimist is because maybe in part to my age, my maturity, or the sheer amount of trauma I had experienced, I wasn't able to recognize what had truly happened to me. And this struggle to recognize the bad that had happened in my life would scar me in ways I had not yet realized. Because if you dance through hell for too long, there's no one who isn't going to get burnt beyond recognition, and I was no different. I would lose the once defining confidence I had in me. I stopped doing things I loved, like soccer and lacrosse, and I began the process of isolating myself from any close friends or family I had around me. As I grew older, this destructive cycle only became more and more prevalent, up until the point where I was not only separating myself from everything I cared about, but beginning actively tearing myself down anytime anything positive was reintroduced into my life. Despite being gifted with a lot more than others at that time, my dad had survived and his relationship with my mom had improved drastically. I had just started high school and had been given a chance to sort of reset my life, but was never really able to realize those blessings at the time. And I would allow myself to dip into the lowest point mentally I've ever experienced in my life so far. And I would stay in that mindset for probably my first freshman year until around the half of my sophomore year. By then, I had gotten into politics, and to put it mildly, I hated politics.
The Boehner bus is outside. Boehner has arrived for any students waiting for Boehner.
I hated politics for so many reasons that if I were to sit here and name every single one, we would all die of old age. But the reason I kept myself so involved with it is because politics allowed me to find a space to reintroduce myself to that dark part of my mind. Because whenever I looked at politics, I only saw the worst in people. People who would fight and argue with each other over their own problems. People who found excuses not to go out and fix them. And I allowed that to fuel my own self-destructive behavior, my mindset, And this would last until one fateful conversation with my
The
grandmother.
Caden Taste bus is outside.
Jesus.
Boehner and Caden Taste have arrived.
In that conversation, I remember talking to her about if,
And
oh my
room
God,
correction, the SAT prep is going to be in Miss Kalana's room, room 39.
in that conversation, I was telling her about how pointless everything was. That if how bad the country was, I don't understand why she hadn't just left already, as I planned to do at the time myself. Because why stay and try to fix a country that's run by madmen? My grandma would tell me something that at the time I didn't take much note of. But that being then, you'd be no better. To say how everyone is this and that and then to run far away, how does anything get better if you don't try to fix it? I didn't answer at the time. Not because it was shaking me to my core, but because of my own stupidity and naivety. I believed it was stupid and naive. But the more that concept stuck in my mind and the more I looked around the world with it, I started to notice and started to realize that no matter where I looked, there wasn't a spot I couldn't find a rose in the concrete. People who took those hardships, those struggles, but instead of letting it consume or destroy them, they pushed past it. Figures like Martin Luther King, timeless musicians like Billie Holiday or Jimi Hendrix. There was always hardship in their lives, but instead of letting it tear them apart, they used it to fuel something so impactful that their shockwaves were felt and indented into our world for decades yet to come. And like so many before me, my catalyst or optimism had been introduced into my life. While I didn't realize it then, it started to...
The Foxcroft Kingsville bus is outside. Foxcroft Kingsville has arrived.
While I didn't realize it then, it had truly started to guide me. I started to play lacrosse again. I started learning how to code and helping out around my community, reconnecting with friends and family. And while this all may seem small, especially in comparison to the actions of the figures previously mentioned, optimism has shown me that it's not about outdoing someone else, and it's not about how long you can dance through hell while ignoring the burns, and it's definitely not about giving up because of others' failed attempts to run through the fire. Optimism is about letting your scars tell a story of triumph and to use it as a map to forging a better tomorrow for yourself and everyone around you.
Okay. I don't know how to stop the recording here, so why don't you come on in here? I was paying attention to the prompter.
Okay.
So, you want to watch your actions here. But, the cadence and the pacing is excellent.
Oh, I got you.
Just have a seat.
Yeah, I'm just taking some.
So, I basically heard the audio. Didn't see the video. But what I heard the audio, with rhythm, with pacing, your emphasis there, I can tell that you're telling a story. That's really what a speech is. It's a story, nothing more than that. It's a story, it's a conversation. So
Sorry, can you hear me? Alright. How has optimism guided me through trying times? It's something I struggle to answer because for the majority of my life, I wouldn't say optimism was a factor in it. The closest you could get is to when I was young, really young, because back then I looked at everything and only saw the best in everything. But I feel that if you did, you'd be mistaking me for an optimist because, as we'll talk about later, it is extremely crucial to be able to recognize the bad, which I can never do. If you saw me in my early high school years, you'd think I was on the complete other side of the spectrum, a whole new person. A nihilist who only tore down everything both in his life and anything that he could get his eyes on. But the reason I'm able to stand before you today and even talk to you about optimism is because optimism has allowed me to see both the best and the worst in my life and turn it into something positive for years and years to come. But it wasn't always like that. See, earlier I said when I was young, you may mistake me for an optimist, but to get more specific, we can look at when I was around 7, 8 years old. Then I was a pretty happy kid. Back then, my defining personality traits, my bravado, my confidence was something you couldn't separate me from. And despite me my best friend moving away, me losing my first family member, and my mom and dad's marriage collapsing, ultimately cultivating in my dad's attempted suicide, always kept a smile on my face. And that would stick with me. And while I hadn't realized it yet, maybe because of my maturity, my age, or just sheer amount of trauma I had experienced at the time, I never quite recovered from it, and it would affect me for years and years to come. Because when anybody walks through the fire for too long, they're destined to get burnt beyond recognition, and I was no exception. My failure to recognize the bad in my life had caused me to begin separating myself from friends, from family. I separated myself from activities I loved doing, like soccer and lacrosse. I became sadder. My grades dropped. And this self-destructive cycle would continue until I entered high school, where it would become so prevalent that it had evolved from just me separating myself from things I cared about to actively tearing down anything I had interest in. It had become more so from getting away from stuff I loved to making sure that I let myself know that I would never amount to anything and nothing I ever even considered worth it was worth doing. This cycle would continue for a while. And despite me receiving blessings like my dad still being alive, him and my mom getting back together and having a substantially improved marriage, being able to go to a new high school, and being given a fresh opportunity to make myself a whole new person, I never saw that. And because of that, I would slip into the worst mindset I had ever found myself in so far in my life. This would last, like I said, for a while, until around my halfway through my sophomore year, when I had gotten into politics. And let me tell you, I hated politics. I hated them for so many reasons that if I were to name them all, we'd all be here till we're dead. But the reason I kept investing myself into it, or investing my energy into it, is because politics gave me an endless number of reasons to find the worst in people. Be it people bickering, people making excuses for themselves, blaming others and using it as a way to exploit hate. It was a gold mine for somebody who just wanted to find the worst in the world. And I remember relaying as much to the only family member I was still close with, being my grandmother. One night I had been telling her all this, and I remember almost insulting her in a way, saying that I didn't understand why she didn't just leave the country, why she'd want to live in a place that's run by madmen. And she told me, then I'd be no better. Then you'd be no better. If you were to say this and that and then to just run away, how can you complain about something and not try to fix it? At the time, I didn't have a response, not because it was shaking me to my core, but because of my own naivety and my stupidity. I believed it was naive and stupid. But this question stuck in my mind. This idea, this concept, this sort of alien idea that people could take good from bad. And while I didn't realize it then, the more and more I looked at the world, the more and more it got to a point where there was nowhere I could look where I couldn't find a rose in the concrete, where I couldn't find somebody or something who, despite their harsh surroundings, still worked to make the world better, whether it be civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King, timeless musicians like Billie Holiday or Jimi Hendrix, people who took their trauma and instead of letting it tear them apart or using it as an excuse to fade away, used it to create a shockwave that indented on the earth for decades yet to come. I didn't realize it, but I can confidently say it now that, like so many before me, I had found my catalyst for optimism to be introduced into my life, and since it's been, I haven't looked back. I've been reconnecting with friends and family. I've put in effort to do things I love, like lacrosse or soccer. I've been helping out with my community, and while, may seem small in comparison to some of the best musicians, some of the most important figures in the country's history, optimism has shown me that it's not about doing more than other people. It's not about dancing through the fire until you're burnt beyond recognition. And it's not about avoiding the fire because of other failed attempts to make it through. Optimism is the ability to look at those fires, push through, and let your scars tell a story of not only triumph, but to use them as a roadmap to make a better tomorrow for you, the people in that audience, the people at home, and anyone who's ever been around you. I'm done. What?